Hi, everyone. So we've made it to week 2. Congratulations. And this week we're going to be diving into some different philosophical concepts. And we're now going to kind of get into the meat of the subject, right? So we're going to be learning about different philosophers. We're going to head deeper into some of those preliminary concepts about professional ethics, consequentialism, principle-based ethics, which is also called deontology, and virtue ethics. So it's here that you're going to be able to begin to dive into some of the philosophers' ideas and the way they relate to each of the various categories we've talked about, and then how to apply that to your thinking and to your posts that you'll be making in the future. So this is really building that foundation for these discussions, and this is the information you'll be using for your discussions, for your week 2 posts. Remember, you should be working with the concepts, using in-text citations, quotations, and of course a reference section at the bottom. And so I'm going to help you out a little bit here and give you some additional information on the textbook and what we're doing. So it begins on page 11, I believe. That's where we left off. And as you can see, we're getting into theory, concepts, and ethical reasoning. And so we're going to be taking a look not at he argued this and he argued that, as the textbook said. Instead, we're going to try to reflect on the importance of the message behind these thinkers and how they apply in your life. So a lot of people think that that philosophy is sort of this roller coaster, this never-ending roller coaster, right? You read one philosopher, let's say Aristotle, for example, and you think, oh yeah, those ideas are great. I can really vibe with those ideas. And then you're going to read Kant, and then you'll find his ideas really exciting, but they're kind of in contrast to some of Aristotle's ideas. And then we'll hit Mill and we'll hit Ross, and the same process kind of happens in which all of these philosophers are having a dialogue over time that goes back to ancient times, and you'll see yourself in all of them. You will see that you agree with some of their ideas, that you disagree with others, and that's going to be a personal choice. And so it's up to you really to figure out what these philosophers are saying. And of course, I'm doing my highlight of different philosopher series, which mostly we'll probably post on Fridays. So you can get a more in-depth look at each of these different philosophers. Of course, I can't cover everybody, but I'll try to highlight some of the key philosophers that we're learning about in the class. But so a lot of students, as the textbooks say, they tend to give up because they're not sure which theory is the correct theory, right? And we really want to debunk that idea. There isn't a correct theory. This is like, think of yourselves starting a book about philosophy and your philosophy of life, and you're covering a variety of topics. What do you think about the nature of religion? What do you think about ethics? Does God exist? Does God not exist, and why? How do you find knowledge? Where does truth come from? All of these various questions come into play, and these are what philosophers are trying to work out for themselves. And so they're each going to come up with an answer according to their unique set of ideals, culture, environment, upbringing, and so forth, just as you would also come up with your own unique philosophy of life. So that's really all they're doing. And so we can't really look to them as having the truth, but we can look at their ideas and see which ones we value, which ones speak to us, and why, and think about how our lives are maybe similar and that's why we really like a particular philosopher's theory, or maybe our lives are really different and so we don't like that theory, and that's fine. This is really your time to begin investigating those ideas and then applying them to the material we're covering in class. So moving forward through our text, it's really going to be this guide of how to reason well, how to think critically in a way to answer some of these questions. And as we sort of mentioned earlier in the class, Socrates really gave this main contribution of Socratic questioning, and that's going to help us become better critical thinkers. And that lays the foundation for us moving forward on various theories that we'll be talking about in class. So as you scroll through the text, you'll notice that really this week we're getting an historical overview and some definitional questions. So some history. We're going to be defining professionalism. You'll watch a series of videos on different types of professionalism. And thinking about types of professional client relationships. And you'll be applying that to some case studies throughout the course. So what you're learning here is foundational. I guess we're having a thunderstorm, but it's sunny here in Florida and I'm outside. But you'll be applying those types of professional client relationships to the case studies that we're discussing, to your smart art. And it's really something that you're going to be using through the rest of the class. So make sure to watch those quick video clips and think about how they're each different from each other and what their main focus is, because that's going to help you answer some of these questions moving forward. Something that you really want to think about here and talk about maybe in your discussion posts this week is the difference between an amateur and a professional. What kind of information or knowledge does an amateur have over a professional? Usually professionals are paid, and amateurs can be paid, and most likely maybe they're not paid. But that is one way of distinguishing them. And then professionals also have a lot more experience. Maybe they've done a lot more schooling on the topic. They're not just starting out. And an amateur we see as in that experimental phase that they're trying new things, right? And we could see like what's easiest, I think, to apply this is to like art, for example, right? If you're an amateur artist, you may not know all the techniques you need yet to get you to those more professional looking paintings. Or if you're an amateur photographer, you're not sure how to work with certain lighting yet, and you're experimenting and trying to figure that out. But by the time you become a professional, you know your craft, you know your skill. And so that's something to think about as we make our way through this week and the information. So as we talked about a little bit last week, this idea of trust, and that's going to carry through into the rest of the class and what we're looking at, particularly in the case study coming up on the veterinarian. And you'll need to think about whether or not you trust Joe to do the right thing. You have developed a relationship with Joe as a veterinarian. And so you may treat him differently than you would a new client that just walked in the door that you don't have a relationship with him. And that's, something important to think about because it applies to our personal lives. We often will make exceptions for people that we know over strangers. And so our ethics might become a little more in the gray area when it comes to people that we know. And that's really because we know what they're going through. We know what led them into making this ethical choice. And we try to give them some leeway for those thoughts. Whereas a stranger, we don't necessarily know how they got to where they are ethically and how they got to making that choice. And so we tend to try to be a little bit more rigid in our thinking. And so really think about the affinity relationship of video that you watch and whether or not you have an affinity with the person ethically and how that affects your decision-making process. So also in this chapter, we're going to see the rising role of science. And so there's been, over time, these arguments between religion and science, who's correct, are the religious arguments correct, are the scientific arguments correct? And so that starts to get really interesting because as we have grown to know more science and gone from religion being sort of the main way in which we draw on our ethics into scientific principles, it's changed the way that we think about ethics and the way that we make our choices. So ancient Greece and Rome sort of struggled with this growing separation between appeals to the supernatural world, what we could now call religion in a sense, and the natural world, or what we would call science. So those are some things to think about when you're making ethical choices, right? Do you go back to your religious beliefs to make ethical choices, and what role do they have in the way that you make choices? Or is your approach more scientific, more based in reason and logic? And I'm not saying one is better than the other, so be careful of that as you're reading through your classmates' posts, because you'll find people in all different camps and in these whole shades of gray. And I think that's helpful because you'll get a variety of perspectives on this topic and how it works really in everybody's life and how they can justify their decision making. So you'll also notice in the chapter the impact of the European Enlightenment. And so the Enlightenment, as you may know from previous classes you've taken, documentaries you've watched, or however it's come into your life, is this kind of explosion of culture, education, scientific discovery, political transformation. And so all these new ideas are coming out in the Enlightenment period. And that's going to impact the way that we see both religion and science. And that's the point at which we start to see that transition from religious thinking into more scientific thinking. And so let's see, other things that I wanted to mention in regards to this chapter are kind of what I mentioned last week when I talked about codes of ethics. You'll see a few places mentioned where you can get codes of ethics, like ethical standards of right and wrong. For physicians, for example, would be the American Medical Association. And so this chapter is going to go into the codes of ethics a little bit more detailed, as I mentioned last week. And here we're going to start seeing a formalization of universal standards, right? So there's this thing in philosophy. Philosophers are always, well, is it relative to the person and to the culture? Or are there universal standards that apply to everybody no matter what? And this is an ongoing dialogue, an ongoing argument in each different branch of philosophy that you'll see as we go through the course. And so it's kind of up to you to decide whether or not you fall in this more relative category or you believe more in universal rules. And so we can find relativistic ideas in consequentialism and more universal ideas in the principle approach or deontology. So that's how that connects there as you're thinking about this chapter and how you're going to apply that moving forward. So that's what I like to say for this particular chapter. And so then we'll get into some additional concepts and theories coming up next week. But this week, I'm going to just give you a quick guide to who our consequentialists are, who our virtue ethicists are, and who our deontologists or principle-based people are. And you can see that under the video. So hopefully this video has been helpful in allowing you to discern some of the ideas we're touching on during week 2. If you have any questions, feel free to get in touch, and I look forward to reading through your discussions.